Today's session is both a GCSE PE session and an A-level session, because if you're doing A-level PE, this could be useful for you as well, because this topic's covered in A-level PE in a similar way. We're looking at the classification of skill. Now, the word classification is one of those ones exam boards love to use, and what they really mean is how something is divided up or grouped in some way. So the first one is called open and closed skills. The next one's called basic and complex skills. And then you've got high and low organisation skills. So in this video, we'll look at how to be able to know the difference between all of those. We'll look at the first classification is called open skills and closed skills. And they fall on what we call a continuum, which is basically a line. So at one end, you've got the most open of skills, and at the other end, you've got the most closed skills. I'll show you one of those in a minute on a little clip. So let's look at open skills first. So open skills occur in open play. So open play is when a game is going on, it's in full flow, you've got to adapt to what you're doing, people on your team are moving around, people on the other team are moving around, you've got to adapt to that scenario. So each time you do that skill, it might be very slightly different, because you've got to play the pass, if you're doing a football pass, at a certain speed to be able to reach that person, or you've got to play it over the top, or you've got to make sure you avoid it being intercepted. So we call open skills occur in open play, because everything is changing around you and you've got to adapt those skills. They're almost never completely identical. You might think they are, but you're always taking something into account. Now at the other end, you've got closed skills. Now the most closed skills are skills that you could perform any time and you have to do it in exactly the same way. So for example, something like a free throw in basketball, where it's like a penalty shot in basketball. You go to the line, that line is always the same distance from the basket, no matter what court you play on. Nobody can stop you taking that shot because it's a free shot. You can take your time and set yourself up and go through a routine, and you decide when you make that shot, nobody else. Okay. Now within closed skills, there is often like a kind of a time sequence you've got to have done it in, but that's normally plenty of time to have achieved that skill. So closed skills are self-paced. Nobody can stop you doing them. And they're always from the same area. Now, somewhere between those open skills and closed skills, you've got other ones slightly in between. So a closed skill could also be seen as a rugby penalty kick. Now, those who know a lot about rugby know that a penalty kick's not always taken from the same spot. But what the kicker will try and do, he'll try and imagine that it is, and he'll go through sub-routines and practice to make sure all of his kicks are actually very, very similar, regardless of where that is on the pitch. Let's look first at open and closed skills. Now, this blue line you can see, that's what we call the continuum. And this is our open and closed continuum. It's basically like a scale from one extreme to the other. So one extreme, we've got open, and the other end, we've got closed skills. Okay. Now, some skills will fit in between. We're going to primarily look at ones that fit nearer to those extremes. Above the closed skill end of the continuum, you've got a basketball player, and they're taking a free throw, which is like a penalty shot, each worth 1 point. You can see that there are players there, but they can't do anything to distract the player. They can't get in his way. He has got time to take the shot to set himself up. Now, that's something he can practice in training, because the line is the same distance away. The basket is always the same height. So that really is a good example of a closed skill. Now, at the far left are our open skills. We've got a player trying to make a pass between maybe two defenders into the path of an ongoing player. Now, there's lots of things going on. The pass has to be the right speed. It has to be the right curl on it, maybe to get round the player. So there's lots of things that player has got to do to make sure it meets that player. It'd be really hard for him to practice that exact situation in practice. He might practice similar situations by doing mini condition games or 3v1, but to actually do the identical scenario would be almost impossible. Now, they'll practice loads and loads and loads doing open skills and open play situations. So when it comes to this situation, he can recall something that's really, really similar, and hopefully his pass will meet the player on his run. So let's look at the close skills. So another example, as I mentioned earlier, is a rugby penalty kick. It's not as closed as the basketball free throw because that could be taken from any part of the pitch. It's not always straight in front of the post. It could be side to side. Now, a football penalty kick might be seen as a bit more closed, but there is a goalie in front. The goalie is also a factor. But what a football penalty taker will try and do when they practice, they're ignoring the goalie. They're just thinking, if I hit it into that spot in the goal, I should score. The keeper makes a save, the keeper's done really, really well. So a penalty taker won't always practice with a football goalie in goal because they're literally trying to hit the same spot in the goal every time. A good penalty taker probably has 2 penalties that they practice to go in 2 separate areas of the goal so they can recall that type of close skill. That's one of the reasons they practice lots of rugby penalty kicks after training and football penalty kicks after training. A netball shot is also relatively closed because if the player catches it, often they're going to shoot probably within 1 to 3 meters from the goal. The defender has to be, under normal circumstances, around 1 meter away. During the pandemic, slightly more. So they've got a chance really of shooting and under little pressure. It's unlikely that the goalkeeper or goal defence are going to put them under enough pressure to stop them taking that shot. And they've probably practiced lots and lots from different spots between 1 and 3 meters around that area. So pretty much it's closed because they've got 3 seconds to take it. That's quite a long time when you've got the ball in your hands. They'll set themselves up and they'll go back to something they did in training and try and replicate that. Now at the other end, you've got something that's more open, would be an interception in netball. So the player's got to time their interception. It won't always look the same. There might be different height, speed on the ball. The player they're marking may be doing something slightly different to normal. So they've got to judge everything that's going on. It'd be impossible to practice that exact situation. Now they'll practice similar situations and hope that during a game, those similar situations will arise and they can adapt in that moment to make the interception. A passing move in rugby. So it's, again, slightly less open because they've got an idea of what they're going to do. They've got a pattern that they're going to do. But the difference is the defenders on the other side might do something different to how it's happened in practice, and so that they may have to slightly adapt, hold the ball slightly longer, make the pass slightly higher, make the pass slightly earlier, make the pass slightly faster. So there are slight differences when it comes to that. Although it's a set move, it's still relatively open because the defence have a factor in that play. The next one's called basic and complex skills. So let's talk about basic at this end first. Basic skills are ones that are relatively easy to do. Often you're taught them first when you're learning a sport. So you might learn how to stop the ball in football using the inside of your foot. You'll then probably learn how to do a simple instep pass in football. In netball, you might learn how to do a chest pass from standing still. So they're relatively simple, basic skills. There's not a lot of moving parts to perform those skills, and you're not under a lot of pressure to often complete those skills. So the pressure in the scenario during a game is often quite low, and therefore you can complete the skill relatively easy. Now at the other end, you've got skills that are difficult to perform, require lots of body part movements. They're done quite quickly, and you might be under quite a bit of pressure when trying to perform those skills. It'll be basic and complex skills. Okay, so there's a continuum. Got basic skills at one end, and we've got complex skills at the far side. Now, for an experienced performer, some skills will come really easy because they've done them so much. But you almost need to think, okay, when I'm learning the skills in that sport, which ones did I learn first? Which ones were maybe slightly easier, all the way up to the ones that are more difficult? Then maybe you can't really do that well. So it's probably likely that they're the more complex skill. So in our basic end, we've got a simple standing chest pass. In basketball, quite simple. There's nobody in the way. We can get the ball straight to our player. It should be relatively easy to do. If we're doing a standing one, we're only really using our arms to propel the ball. Now on the far side, we've got a football overhead kick. Now the ball's probably moving fast through the air. The player's got to move their feet to get into position. They've got to adjust how they're going to jump. They've got to judge the flight of the ball. They've then got to get into a good takeoff position. They've got to use their arms to gain momentum to get up. They've got to get to the right height. And then they've got to use their agility to move quickly to change direction to be able to go into that position to play an overhead kick and then still try and get accuracy because it's normally a shot on goal. So that's why that one is a complex skill. Now, at our far end, we've also got running. At a young age, in a toddler, it looks really complicated, but then you soon get to grips with it, and running essentially becomes quite a natural skill of moving your legs and arms. Cycling's another one. Again, people have to learn how to cycle, and it can seem pretty tricky. If you can remember that far back when you learned to cycle, it's not that simple to learn, but as soon as you can gain your balance, the actual skill of turning the pedals over and steering are relatively basic. And at the far end, our complex, we've got this overhead kick. We've got an Indian dribble in hockey, person moving the ball from side to side quickly, maybe moving in and out of players. It's a really quite tricky skill to do because you're moving quickly with your legs. You're having to use both hands to manipulate the stick and to be able to direct the ball in and around people. And then the smash in tennis, because you've got to get your feet right. A bit like an overhead kick, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to get really into the correct position. You've got to set yourself. The ball's probably coming out of the air. The wind might be affecting the flight of the ball, so you've got to keep doing small adjustments, and then you've got to time the swing of the racket perfectly to be able to hit the ball and hit it into the correct part of the court. Now, the last continuum is called low organisation and high organisation skills. Now, this is probably the most tricky. So when it comes to an exam, you've got to know certain things. You've got to use the word subroutines, and I'll explain those in a minute. And you've got to know about a little bit more about coaching, because these really come down to how a skill is coached. Now, low organisation skills at one end, they're really simple for a coach to teach because they can teach a little bit of the skill on its own. So for example, in swimming, when you're learning front crawl as a beginner or even as an advanced, if the coach wants to work on one little bit, let's say the arm action, they could isolate one arm using a float. They could isolate the legs using a pull buoy and just literally work on one arm coming over the top, focusing on maybe one part of a weakness. Now, in a beginner, they're going to work on just trying to hone the skill. In an advanced person, they could isolate it and really work on one bit of the weakness. Now, just by doing one arm action, the person can propel themselves in the pool and still be doing some swimming. They can do part of the technique and just focus on that. Now, at the other end of the scale, you've got high organisation skills. Now, these ones have what we call very few subroutines. They almost have to be performed all at once. So, for example, if you were doing a trampolining and you were doing a somersault on trampolining, it's very hard to do a half a somersault or a quarter because you're going to land really awkwardly. You've almost got to do the whole thing all at once. And each time you practice to improve, you've got to do that whole thing each time and change little bits on your own while you're in the air. Now, if I go back to my swimming example, the coach, could develop different parts of the skill lesson to lesson and work on arm action, they could work on breathing, they could work on legs all separately. Now, to do a forward roll or a somersault, you've almost got to work on the whole skill all at once, which makes it a lot more difficult to teach. So this is the low and high organisation skills continuum. We've got low organisation skills at one end, and we've got high organisation skills at the other. So low organisation skills are easy to break down. They've got subroutines that are clear and can be practiced in isolation. Whereas high organisation skills, their subroutines can't be broken down as easily and often need to be practiced as a whole skill. So we've got swimming as a low organisation skills because you can isolate different body parts and practice one part in isolation. You can practice one arm in isolation by holding a float. You've got a set shot in basketball where you can use and practice different subroutines. So you could practice the one arm action, you could practice two arm action, you could do it from no knees bent, you could add the knee bend in, you can get your stance correct, you can break that down quite easily. And then triple jump, although triple jump is quite a difficult skill overall to complete, actually it has distinct subroutines: the run up, the hop, the step and the jump, and each bit can be practiced in isolation. So you could just practice hopping on its own. You could practice your run into your hop. You could practice just hop and then step. It's really easily broken down, and then you can put it back together all as one whole. At the other end, you've got high diving. Now, because it's fast moving and the whole skills don't have many subroutines, it's really hard to practice bits in isolation. It's hard to practice half a somersault, for example. Cartwheels also would look a bit messy if you practiced a small part of a cartwheel. It could result in injury, so you've got to learn the skill as a whole. And the last bit is golf swing. Now, the golf swing, although you possibly could do it slowly and you could break down maybe the back swing, actually to practice the whole swing from the back swing and through the ball, it's very hard to chop it into pieces and cut it into subroutines. You've almost got to practice the whole thing all at the same time. So in an exam, the kind of questions they're going to ask you, they're going to give you maybe an example of a skill, and you're going to have to decide where it is on those continuums. They might ask specifically, is it a basic or a complex skill? Is it an open or a closed skill? They might ask, is it a low or a high organisation skill? They might leave it a bit more open-ended than that. They might ask you to try and classify it using 2 or 3 of those continuums. Okay, that would make it a little bit more tricky, but each skill could be put on all 3 of those lines. In a longer answer question, you might get asked a little bit about the coaching of those skills, how a coach might use things like feedback and guidance as well to kind of coach these skills, but also taking into account whether they're a basic or complex, whether they're a high or a low organisation. So if you want to learn a bit more about feedback or guidance, check out the video, one on feedback and one on guidance. Check those out, and I'll leave a playlist at the end so you can have access to those as well. I hope you enjoyed this. Best of luck. I'll try and get another video as soon as possible.